14:32 hours, March 23rd, 1983. Washington Field Office, FBI Counterintelligence Division. The recording from Interview Room 4 began with the soft click of a reel-to-reel machine and the scrape of a chair on linoleum. A woman in her early 40s, dark blue office coat, sensible shoes, sat down at a bare metal table. She placed her handbag carefully in front of her, fingers resting on the clasp as if it were the only solid thing in the room. Her name was Patricia Whitmore. On paper, she was a school administrator from Bethesda, Maryland. In reality, over the next few weeks, she would become the unexpected trigger that pulled a Cold War operation apart. She had not come in as a patriot. She had come in as a wife. According to the FBI's later summary, she opened with a simple line. She believed her husband, a defense engineer with a security clearance, was having an affair with a neighbor. She thought he might be sharing secret information with that woman. It was not true when she said it. She said it because she wanted to hurt him. But the strange thing about the Cold War was this. Sometimes a lie spoken in anger landed so close to the truth that the machinery of an entire security state began to move. And once it moved, it did not stop for anyone's marriage. Somewhere, far from that fluorescent-lit room, a KGB file already existed with the name of her husband on it. The Soviets called it something dry and anonymous, an access asset. In FBI files, he would soon acquire a different label, subject. His name was Thomas Whitmore. By the spring of 1983, the détente of the 1970s had curdled. In Washington, President Reagan was talking about an evil empire. In Moscow, the leadership stared at grainy overhead images of American bases and saw a steady tightening of the noose. Missiles, radar stations, listening posts, satellites, all of it was part of a nervous, permanent mobilization. One of the quiet front lines ran straight through office cubicles and engineering labs. The Pentagon had poured money into electronic warfare, jamming Soviet radar, confusing their missiles, building systems that could blind enemy defenses long enough for American aircraft to get through. That work did not happen in secret bunkers in the desert. It happened in office parks off the Beltway, in anonymous brick buildings with tinted windows, security badges, and parking lots full of Chevrolets and Oldsmobiles. In one of those buildings, in a contractor facility outside Washington, Thomas Whitmore spent his days staring at circuit diagrams and signal processing algorithms. On file, he was a mid-level electrical engineer. He held a secret clearance, not the highest level in government, but still enough to open doors marked with red-bordered warning labels. He had been granted that clearance in 1976, after the usual background checks, interviews with neighbors, credit reports, an uncomfortable series of questions about sex, politics, and drinking habits. He passed easily. He did not drink heavily. He did not hold radical views. He seemed, in the official phrase, stable and reliable. The security officers who signed his clearance did not see the future version of him. A man in his 40s, tired of his life, open to flattery, desperate to feel important again. The clearance process could pull his credit report. It could not read his loneliness. At home, in Bethesda, the war felt distant. The Whitmores lived on Glenbrook Road, in a 3-bedroom brick house, typical of the neighborhood. A patch of front lawn, a flagstone path, narrow flower beds that tried and mostly failed to tame the Maryland soil. The basement smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old cardboard boxes. The dining room was dominated by a rectangular table bought on sale 10 years before, carrying the small scars of family life. A fork mark here, a ring from a sweating glass there. The couple had 2 daughters, 12 and 14, who went to a nearby middle school, rode their bikes to the community pool in summer, and watched sitcoms in the evening with a bowl of popcorn between them. From the outside, it was a postcard. Inside, by early 1983, the marriage was cracking in quiet, unremarkable ways. Not through violence or screaming, but through distance, miscommunication, and the slow erosion that comes from years of unresolved small resentments. Patricia ran most of the household. She kept the school schedules straight, paid the utilities, remembered birthdays. She had long ago stopped expecting flowers or anniversaries properly celebrated. She was not theatrical in her disappointment. She simply carried it around like an extra weight. Thomas, for his part, drifted into the familiar pattern of men his age, who had once believed themselves destined for something large, and now realized they were solid, replaceable professionals. He was respected at work, but not brilliant. Valued, but not indispensable. He had reached the middle level of a career ladder that now stretched above him in increasingly unrealistic steps. At home, he was present and absent at the same time, physically there, mentally elsewhere. He came home late, claiming project deadlines. He ate in front of the TV. He answered questions with half sentences. He had not consciously decided to withdraw. He simply had not consciously chosen to stay engaged. What neither of them knew was that their private discontent would soon intersect with a foreign intelligence service. A few miles away, on Bradley Boulevard, an apartment on the second floor of a modest building had been carefully prepared for its tenant. The lease was in the name of Helen Miller, a widow from Ohio. Her file, in the American system, showed a sparse but plausible history. Late husband, a small inheritance, no recent employment. For landlords and DMV clerks, that was enough. In Moscow, however, her personnel file was thicker and carried a different name. Elena Marova had been born in the Soviet Union in the 1940s. She had grown up in cramped communal apartments with thin walls, watched relatives disappear in the late Stalin years, and learned early that listening quietly was often safer than speaking. The KGB had noticed her in university. Good languages, sharp memory, disciplined temperament. Over time, she was cultivated, trained, and eventually selected for illegals work, operations under deep cover abroad, with no diplomatic passport to protect her. By the time she arrived in the United States under the name Helen Miller, she knew how to build a life from scratch, how to acquire friends without revealing anything important, how to make a small apartment feel convincingly personal while hiding its professional functions, how to arrange routine in such a way that surveillance would see only boredom. Her mission, formalized in KGB paperwork in even colder language than the FBI's, was simple in theory and difficult in practice. Establish proximity to American personnel with access to defense technology. Identify discontent, greed, or vulnerability. Exploit it. In Bethesda and the surrounding suburbs, there was no shortage of targets. But most were cautious. Many were happily married. Some simply didn't respond to her. Thomas Whitmore was different. According to later FBI reconstructions based on surveillance logs and interviews, the first approach took place in the summer of 1982 at the community pool. The pool was a predictable location. Whitmore brought his daughters there on Saturdays. He read technical journals or the Washington Post on a folding chair while they splashed with friends. A man who returned to the same place, at the same time, in the same pattern. That predictability was useful. One Saturday afternoon, as the sun bounced off the surface of the water and kids shouted over each other in a blur of noise, a woman in a black one-piece swimsuit walked past his chair, paused, and asked him if he knew the closing time. Her voice carried a faint accent he couldn't quite place, somewhere between Midwest and something foreign. He answered. She smiled, thanked him, and moved on. It was a brief, forgettable moment. 2 weeks later, he saw her again, this time sitting alone with a paperback. The cover showed an American novel, but when the wind flipped a page briefly, he thought he saw small pencil notations in the margins, the kind a serious reader makes. They spoke a little longer that day. She introduced herself as Helen, a widow, new to the area. She made a self-deprecating joke about getting lost in the Beltway system. He made a dry comment about the confusion of exit ramps that made her laugh. He went home that evening and mentioned her only in passing to Patricia as a neighbor at the pool who reads more than the others. Over the next weeks, their paths crossed in other places. At a local grocery store, at a coffee shop near his office, on the sidewalk, returning from the mailbox. It did not feel orchestrated to him. To her, it was carefully paced, each encounter designed to lengthen the conversation by a few minutes, to test his responses, to calibrate how much attention he was hungry for. She learned small things. That he worked in electronics for a defense contractor, that he had 2 daughters, that he had lived in the same house more than a decade, that he made no mention of hobbies involving other adults. She also noticed what he didn't say. He never casually described his wife in affectionate terms. He never mentioned weekend trips or date nights. There was, in his domain, a flatness when the subject of home came up. For someone trained to detect fissures, that flatness was a signal. The first unambiguously intentional meeting took place on October 8th, 1982, in a small wine bar in downtown Bethesda. He did not know that the choice of location had been recommended in advance by Moscow Center Notes, a neutral, somewhat upscale venue where a mid-career professional would feel flattered but not out of place. Helen, Elena, underneath, arrived slightly late by design. He had time to sit, to feel awkward, to question whether he had misread the situation. By the time she appeared, apologizing lightly for traffic, he was relieved enough that his guard dropped another inch. They ordered wine. She asked about his work, but in the way intelligent civilians do, not probing for secrets, but for stories. She said she found technology fascinating, even if she did not understand the equations. He, who spent his days describing complex systems to board managers, suddenly had an attentive audience. The more he talked, the more she listened. The more she listened, the more important he felt. Later, in his confession, he would insist that at this stage he said nothing classified. He spoke in abstractions, radar, jamming, signals, the kind of vocabulary that appeared in defense magazines anyone could buy. In his mind, there was a clear line between general and secret, and he believed they were still on the safe side of it. It was after the second glass that the conversation shifted from work to home. She said she sometimes found the evenings lonely. The apartment was quiet. Her husband's absence still felt strange. She missed, she said, the silly, small routines of married life. As she spoke, her eyes moved away from his, as if embarrassed to admit such need. He heard his own situation reflected in hers, albeit with reversed roles. Without quite realizing it, he began to describe his own home in tones of absence, the conversations that no longer happened, the nights spent in different rooms, the feeling of being taken for granted. What she was building was not just affection, it was complicity. Not sex yet, but shared grievance. By the time they left the bar, it felt natural to continue talking somewhere else. Her apartment was close. She made a comment about a bottle of wine she had at home. He did not resist. They spent their first night together on a sofa that had been chosen precisely because it did not look like a spy's furniture. The lamp in the corner, the framed prints on the wall, the small plant on the windowsill, every detail was carefully generic. He left after midnight, walking down the stairs with his tie loosened and his hair slightly out of place, and drove home, telling himself that he would explain, or end it, or at least think about what this meant. He did none of those things. Over the following months, their pattern solidified. He began visiting the apartment 3 to 5 times a week, usually in the late afternoon or early evening. Sometimes he arrived still carrying his briefcase, the same one that held secure folders during working hours. Occasionally, he went there on the pretext of working late, calling home to say a project required him to stay at the office. In the apartment, the evenings blurred together. Food, conversation, sex, more conversation. If he noticed the small inconsistencies in her backstory, the way her Ohio childhood lacked specific details, the way her supposed late husband never acquired a clear job or personality, he pushed them aside as minor oddities. He was not used to interrogating people's narratives. That skill belonged to other agencies. Helen, for her part, followed a familiar playbook. First came empathy, confirming his perception that he was undervalued, unheard, unappreciated. Then came admiration, telling him that what he did was crucial, that he was part of something larger, that his expertise was rare. Finally, slowly, came curiosity. It began with harmless-seeming questions. She asked what exactly jamming meant. He explained in layman's terms how radar worked, how signals bounced, how noise could drown a returning echo. She asked if American systems were much better than Soviet ones. He told stories of tests, of exercises, of our guys outmatching theirs, though he had never personally seen a Soviet radar. At first, this was still unclassified territory. He could have given the same explanations to a journalist, but as the nights went on, she encouraged more detail. She did not say, "Bring me documents." She said, I wish I could understand the stress you are under. I wish I could really see what you are working on so I could share it with you. In January 1983, after one such conversation, he made the decision that crossed the legal line. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself the manual was only marked confidential, not top secret. He told himself Helen was not an enemy agent, just a curious, intelligent woman. When he put the stapled manual into his briefcase that morning at work, no alarms went off. He had legal access to it. He passed through the security desk, nodded to the guard, drove out of the parking lot as he did every day. That evening, he took the manual out of the briefcase in Helen's apartment and laid it on the coffee table almost proudly. He began to walk her through diagrams, blocks, and schematics, explaining what they did. She listened. She asked questions at the right moments, and when he went to the bathroom, she moved with professional efficiency, positioning a small camera, flipping pages, photographing each one. Her heart rate did not spike. She had done this before. The manual was back in his briefcase when he left. He returned it to the office the next day. As far as he could see, the document had never left his possession for more than a few minutes. In reality, its contents were already on a path. From film to dead drop to diplomatic bag to a photo lab in Moscow, where men who would never know the meaning of the word Patricia would study the diagrams and adjust their own calculations of American capabilities. In the following weeks, he repeated the behavior. One more manual, then a set of specifications, then a memo summarizing test results. Each time he felt a jab of anxiety, but each time he reassured himself with the same phrases. It was technical. It was not war plans. It was nothing a friendly neighbor would misuse. At no point did he consciously think of himself as a spy. He thought of himself as a man bending a rule for personal reasons. The law would disagree. Back on Glenbrook Road, Patricia saw the symptoms before she grasped their meaning. At first it was small things. He came home later without clear explanations. He seemed more attentive to his appearance, standing longer in front of the mirror, smoothing his hair, adjusting his shirt. He was distracted at dinner, smiling at some private thought. When she asked, he said there were project deadlines, pressure from managers, new contracts. The story was plausible. Many defense workers came home late. The job gave him cover. But the rhythms changed. Phone calls came through that he took in another room. There were unexplained receipts for meals in Bethesda he said were work-related. He smelled of a perfume that wasn't hers, faint but unmistakable. By late February, the pattern hardened into suspicion. She confronted him once in the kitchen, in the flat tone of someone testing a boundary. He denied it, not angrily, but with an irritated weariness, as if the accusation was another form of nagging. He said she was imagining things. That hurt more than open conflict. It turned her from a partner into a supposed hysteric in her own home. On the evening of March 6th, he said he had to go out to meet colleagues for dinner. He put on a clean shirt and left in the car around 6. Patricia waited 15 minutes, then took her own car keys. She had never followed anyone before. She did not know the tradecraft of tailing. She simply kept enough distance to avoid being obvious and focused on not losing him in traffic. Her palms were damp on the steering wheel. She watched him drive, not toward downtown Washington or the office park, but into a residential area closer to the Bradley Boulevard apartments. She saw his brake lights flare as he turned into a parking lot. She kept going past the entrance, then circled back slowly and found a spot on the street where she could watch the building entrance through her windshield. She sat there as light faded, as windows in the building glowed one by one. He did not come out quickly. As the minutes stretched into an hour, then two, the hope that this was a short, innocent visit died. She did not march up to the door. She did not ring the bell. She stayed in the car, swallowing anger and humiliation, until he finally emerged, headed back to the parking lot, and drove away, unaware that his wife's eyes were following him from a stationary car. She repeated the surveillance 2 more times over the following weeks, careful, quiet, giving him more than enough opportunity to prove her wrong. He did not. When she finally confronted him again, on the night of March 22nd, the conversation had the rawness of something postponed too long. The children were upstairs. The TV was off. The house seemed to lean in, listening. He denied it at first, then, cornered by specific details, conceded that there was someone, a widow, lonely, someone who, in his words, understood him in a way Patricia no longer did. The blame shifted quickly. He accused her of being controlling, of having let the marriage die, of focusing only on the children and practicalities. It was a familiar defense tactic. Turn infidelity into a reaction to neglect. Turn wrongdoing into self-pity. His words did not just wound her, they humiliated her. She went to bed in another room, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, anger and despair mixing into something colder. Somewhere in the early morning hours, a different thought emerged. If she could not reach him as a wife, she could reach him as an employee. He loved his work. He loved his clearance. He cared about being part of something important. If she took that away, he would understand what he had done to their life. It was revenge and something else, a twisted attempt to rebalance power. By the time the sun came up on March 23rd, she had decided. She showered, dressed, helped the children off to school. Then she opened the phone book and looked for the number of the nearest FBI office. The receptionist at the Washington field office answered in a neutral, official voice. Patricia asked, in a calm tone that surprised even herself, how one reported a possible security issue involving someone with a clearance. The word security did what anger, cries, and pleas could not. It connected her domestic crisis to the machinery of the state. Within hours, an appointment was arranged. That afternoon, she sat across from Special Agent David Kessler in Interview Room 4. The room was deliberately plain. White walls, metal table, no distractions. A small tape recorder on the table spun silently. Kessler began with standard questions. Name, address, husband's employer. What made her believe there was a problem? His voice was neutral, patient. He had heard dozens of suspicious spouses before, many of whom wanted only to use the FBI as leverage in domestic disputes. Patricia told him her husband had a security clearance and worked in electronics for a defense contractor. She explained the pattern of late nights, the apartment on Bradley Boulevard, the woman calling herself Helen Miller. She described following him, the hours he spent inside. Then she said the sentence that changed the nature of the interview. She said she believed he might be sharing classified information with this woman. It was not a belief. It was a weapon. At that moment, she had no proof of anything beyond adultery. But from the FBI's perspective, belief was not the issue. Risk was. A defense engineer with a clearance, engaged in a secret extramarital affair with an unknown woman whose background was murky. That combination was exactly the sort of vulnerability their internal briefings warned about. Kessler asked for the neighbor's name, address, any details Patricia had observed, license plate digits, schedule patterns, physical description. She provided what she could. She did not mention that she had added the security concern purely to ensure action. That omission would never appear in any official report. By the end of the 45-minute session, Kessler had enough to do two things: open a preliminary inquiry on Thomas Whitmore and run the name Helen Miller through the available databases. The first check did not return much. A driver's license, a local address, no criminal record. But when field agents dug deeper into her supposed past, the gaps became glaring. No prior employment records, no school records, a social security number issued only a few years earlier, with no supporting history. Alone, that could have been a bureaucratic error. Combined with proximity to a cleared defense worker, it was something else. The internal recommendation was straightforward: initiate discreet surveillance on both Whitmore and Miller. From Patricia's perspective, she had simply reported her husband. From the system's perspective, she had activated a case file that would involve multiple agents, weeks of surveillance, and ultimately a prisoner exchange between superpowers. Surveillance teams took up positions within days. Cars parked where they had never parked before. A man reading a newspaper too long in a diner. A woman pushing a stroller past the same apartment building twice in an hour. From the outside, Bethesda looked as ordinary as ever. Inside that ordinary skin, the state's eyes opened wider. Agents tracked Whitmore's movements, from his home on Glenbrook Road to the contractor facility, from the facility to Bradley Boulevard, from Bradley Boulevard back home. They noted times, durations, and routes. At the same time, they watched Helen. On the evening of April 10th, an agent sitting in an unmarked sedan near her building saw her leave carrying a manila envelope. She placed it in a tote bag and walked in a calm, unhurried manner to a nearby bus stop, then to a small shopping center in Silver Spring. Her route was not perfectly straight. She paused twice to look in store windows, once to adjust her shoe. To someone trained in counter-surveillance, these pauses looked less casual. At the shopping center parking lot, she moved between cars as if looking for one in particular. She stopped at a sedan with its door unlocked, opened it, placed the envelope under the front seat, and closed it again. Then she walked away, not looking back. 20 minutes later, a different car pulled up. A man got out, opened the sedan, retrieved the envelope, and drove off. Agents followed him to an apartment building in Alexandria, known to house several employees of the Soviet embassy. This pattern, repeated more than once, was enough. The envelope drops, the connection to embassy personnel, the lack of background. Together, they drew a clear outline. The woman calling herself Helen Miller was not simply a lonely widow. She was a professional intelligence asset. At that point, the FBI faced a choice. They could continue surveillance, hoping to uncover more of the network, or they could move quickly to limit further damage, accepting that some aspects of the operation would remain in shadow. The decision, pushed by the fact that classified material might already be compromised, was to act. And that meant a knock on the Whitmore's front door at 7:15 a.m. On April 12, 1983. Thomas Whitmore left his coffee half-finished on the kitchen table and went to the hallway to retrieve his briefcase. He expected another ordinary day, a commute, a meeting, hours of staring at diagrams. When he opened the front door, 4 men stood on the porch. 2 wore suits. 2 wore jackets over shirts that still somehow looked official. One of the men in a suit held up a wallet with a badge. They identified themselves as FBI. They asked if they could come in. He stepped back without arguing. Years of internal security briefings had prepared him for the possibility of audits, inquiries, random checks. He had never imagined them showing up at his house, but the authority of the badge was familiar. In the living room, Patricia hovered at the edge of the scene. The agents asked if they could speak to Thomas alone. She went upstairs, her heart beating hard enough that she felt it in her ears. Downstairs, the conversation began politely. The lead agent, Kessler, said there had been a concern raised about a possible security issue and that they needed to clarify some facts. His tone was almost conversational, the way a doctor speaks before delivering bad news. He asked about Whitmore's job, about the nature of the projects he worked on, about his clearance. All of this was information they already had. Then he shifted. He asked whether Thomas knew a woman named Helen Miller, whether he had ever visited her apartment on Bradley Boulevard, whether he had any kind of relationship with her. At first, Thomas tried to contain the damage. He admitted knowing her, described her as a friend, denied that the relationship was romantic. Under further questioning, pressed for details on dates and times, he acknowledged that yes, they had been involved. The agents did not react dramatically. They did not raise their voices. They did not moralize. They asked the next questions. Had he ever discussed his work with her? Had he ever brought any documents from work to her apartment? His answers, at the beginning, remained firm. No, never. He knew the rules. He would never risk his clearance. But the agents had already watched him going in and out of that apartment. They had already seen the dead drop. They already had a warrant for a search of Helen's place. They knew, or strongly suspected, that there was more. They did not confront him with all of that at once. Instead, they allowed silences to grow longer after each denial. Let him feel the weight of their knowledge without spelling it out. At some point in that morning, the internal dam he had built, the separation between personal mistake and professional integrity, began to crack. He saw in the still faces of the men across the coffee table that this was no longer just a marital issue. This was a federal investigation. He admitted bringing one manual, then another, then the memo. Each confession was followed by a quick rationalization. He had not meant harm. The documents were only confidential. He had been trying to share his world with someone he loved. The tape of that interview, later transcribed and placed into a file marked with his case number, captured the gradual descent from confident denial to hesitant admission to exhausted, deflated truth. At the end, the agents told him He was now the subject of a criminal investigation under the Espionage Act. They did not place him in handcuffs that morning. They did, however, ask for his cooperation. If he helped, they said, it could make a difference. The offer was clear enough. The door to a plea bargain opened that day in his living room. Upstairs, Patricia sat on the bed they had once shared and listened to the murmur of voices below. She could not hear the words, only the rhythm. She did not know the details yet, but she knew that the simple, angry statement she had made in a gray interview room, "I think he might be sharing secrets," had become real in a way even she had not anticipated. Her revenge had brought the state to her door. It had also revealed a reality she had not imagined. He truly had taken documents to that apartment. Her lie had turned out to be true. 2 days later, at 6:45 a.m. on April 14th, a different team of agents climbed the stairwell of the Bradley Boulevard building, stopped outside Helen Miller's door, and knocked. Inside, Elena understood, with one glance through the peephole, that the operation was over. She opened the door calmly. The agents entered with a warrant, identifying themselves, explaining that they were there to conduct a search. She did not resist. She did not protest. She asked, in a polite voice, whether she should sit somewhere. They indicated the sofa. They moved through the apartment, opening drawers, checking behind hanging clothes, looking under beds. What they found confirmed their suspicions, and more. In a hollowed-out book on a shelf, they discovered a small camera. In a drawer, they found undeveloped microfilm. In a box at the back of a closet, under fabric, lay a shortwave radio receiver and a small notebook of codes written in a hand that did not match any American cursive. Most damning were the photographs. Clear images of technical manuals and memos with Thomas Whitmore's name on the circulation list, pages bearing the familiar red "Confidential" stamp. It was a textbook illegal residency cache, with one exception. Good training would have required her to eliminate local copies of sensitive material once it had been safely passed along. The fact that she still held those photographs suggested either a personal error or the speed at which events had moved since the last exchange. When the agents notified her formally that she was under arrest, she said nothing. She did not ask for a lawyer by name. She did not volunteer information. She maintained the Helen Miller identity through the initial hours of questioning, referring to herself as a misunderstood widow caught in something confusing. Only later, after diplomatic channels became involved, did her true status as a Soviet intelligence officer emerge fully. For the FBI, the case had crystallized. A cleared defense engineer had carried documents out of a secure facility and handed them to a foreign intelligence officer. The material was not the most sensitive in the Pentagon's vaults, but it was valuable. It provided the Soviet Union with insights into American electronic warfare capabilities. The question now was not whether a crime had been committed. It was how to handle it. The United States government had options. They could seek a full public trial for Whitmore under the Espionage Act, expose the details in court, demand a severe sentence as a deterrent. They could indict the woman known as Helen, present her as a caught spy, and put her on display in the media. Instead, both cases were pulled, to varying degrees, into the realm where law met diplomacy. For Thomas, the path led through negotiation. His lawyer, appointed soon after formal charges were filed, argued that while his actions were unquestionably criminal, there were mitigating factors. Thomas had not been recruited through ideology or greed. He had received no money. He had not approached the Soviets. They had approached him. He had cooperated with the investigation once confronted, providing details that helped confirm Helen's role and the extent of the compromise. Prosecutors, balancing the desire to send a message with the realities of their evidence and the wish to avoid exposing too much about American systems in open court, agreed to a plea arrangement. In July 1983, standing in a federal courtroom in a suit that no longer fit quite right, Thomas Whitmore pleaded guilty not to full-fledged espionage, but to mishandling classified information. The judge, after listening to the summaries and statements, sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison. He served roughly 14, in a facility where most inmates had committed financial crimes or nonviolent offenses. To them, he was the spy guy, though in his own mind, he still resisted that label. He spent his time working in the prison library, reading, and avoiding trouble. There was little drama in his incarceration. The drama had already taken place. For Elena, the path was different. Her status as a Soviet intelligence officer made her not just a criminal, but also a bargaining chip. The Soviet Union, for all its public denials of espionage, valued its officers. Within months of her arrest, discussions began through diplomatic channels about a possible exchange. On August 30th, 1983, she was taken, under heavy guard, to a location that remained classified in most public records. There, in a procedure refined by decades of spy swaps, she was exchanged for Americans held in Eastern Bloc prisons on charges of spying. She disappeared back across the lines of the Cold War into a world of internal debriefings and classified assessments. Her American alias died the day she stepped onto Soviet-controlled ground. What became of her afterwards is left to imagination in fragments. A debrief with KGB superiors, perhaps a quiet post away from field work, perhaps suspicion for having been caught at all. Back in Bethesda, the public fallout was smaller than one might expect. There was no national news frenzy. The case was not dramatic enough, not high-ranking enough, to capture headlines beyond a few brief mentions in local papers. The story was overshadowed by bigger crises, larger scandals. In the cold logic of the era, he was one small piece in a much larger board. For the people closest to him, however, the consequences were everything. Patricia filed for divorce while he was still awaiting trial. She cited infidelity, abandonment, and actions that endangered the family. The legal language was restrained. The emotional reality was not. She kept the house on Glenbrook Road. She raised their daughters largely alone, dealing with the quiet stigma of having an ex-husband who had given secrets to the Russians. Neighbors pretended not to gossip. Families in similar positions rarely receive support. Their pain is too tangled up with national narratives. Years later, when asked by a relative whether she regretted going to the FBI, she reportedly answered in a way that captured the complexity of the case. She regretted the marriage. She regretted that he had betrayed her. She regretted that there had ever been a need to make such a phone call. But the call itself, the report, she considered necessary. He made his choices, she is said to have remarked. I just told someone to look. Thomas, after prison, could never return to defense work. His clearance was permanently revoked. No contractor would hire a man with his record. He moved to another state, took lower-profile engineering jobs in the commercial electronics sector, lived modestly. He remarried once, quietly, to a woman who knew at least parts of his past. He died in 2006 of heart disease, at an age that did not qualify as old. His obituary in a local paper mentioned his profession, his children, and his church attendance. It did not mention the case file that still bore his name in an archive. Somewhere in the depth of a government records center, in a room cooled to protect paper and film, there is a box labeled with an alphanumeric code. Inside that box, among interoffice memos and court transcripts, there is a thin file tabbed Whitmore. The documents inside are unremarkable to the casual eye. Interview transcripts, surveillance logs, copies of technical pages bearing classification stamps, a pre-sentence report. It is not a famous case. It is not taught in academies. It is one small example among many of how espionage actually occurred, not with dramatic exchanges on bridges at midnight, but with affairs in apartments, manila envelopes in parked cars, and quiet knocks on suburban doors. What gives it its peculiar weight is the way it began. A woman, in pain, lied. She accused her husband of something she did not truly know he had done. She used the language of national security to weaponize personal betrayal. In doing so, she accidentally described reality. The system, built to assume that domestic entanglements could be exploited by foreign powers, took her statement at face value and moved. It did not care that she had intended it as an exaggeration to ensure attention. It cared that the risk she described was plausible. From one perspective, she was vindicated. Her suspicions, framed as a worst-case scenario, were correct. From another perspective, she was both victim and instrument, a citizen who, in seeking to assert control over her own life, activated forces she could not fully direct. There is a temptation in stories like this to sort the characters neatly into roles: traitor, hero, villain, innocent. Reality resists that clarity. Thomas did not set out to betray his country. He set out to escape his own dissatisfaction, to feel valued and desired, and in doing so, he treated the boundaries of his professional responsibilities as flexible. That flexibility is exactly what foreign services count on. Elena did not harbor personal hatred for the man she seduced. She viewed him as a target in a structural conflict, someone whose emotional needs could be converted into intelligence reports, whose loneliness could be turned into diagrams on a desk in Moscow. She was a tool of her system as much as its agent. Patricia found herself between them, forced to confront the fact that the same system that had ignored her when she complained of boredom and neglect in her marriage moved quickly when she spoke the language it respected. Security, clearance, national risk. The Cold War needed fear, loyalty, and silence to maintain its balance. It taught citizens to mistrust the stranger, to report the suspicious, to accept that the government had a legitimate claim on their privacy if security was at stake. In that atmosphere, intimate relationships were never entirely private. A marriage could become an attack surface. An affair could become a vector. A single phone call could transform a domestic argument into a federal case. In the end, what remains from the Whitmore case is not a grand moral about patriotism or treason. It is something quieter and more disquieting. The price of secrecy is often paid by ordinary people whose only real crime, at the beginning, was to be lonely in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the gaze of systems that do not distinguish between private weakness and public danger. And sometimes, the most destructive thing a person can say is not a carefully planned lie, but a desperate sentence spoken in anger that happens to touch the truth.